What's up, guys, and welcome to Work Wednesday. Today I've got a fun one for you. Today I'm going to talk about my pedal board setup and the best ways to set up your pedal board for any gig situation with any amp. And so here we go. When you're setting up your pedal board, it's important to go in a certain order. And the reason why is things sound better in a particular order and they sound worse in the opposite order. So here's the order you want to think of. So generally you want to start with drives, and the reason why is drives do well into timed effects or modulation, but modulation does not do very well into drives. So this is an important thing to keep in mind because we're going to go over this more later when we start talking about amps and effects loops, which is where we're going with this. Starting off, you want lighter drives into heavier drives. You just want them to get more intense as they go. Think about it that way. So you want to start with any filter effects, for example, your wah, and then move to compression or clean boosts, and then into light overdrives, and then to higher drives like gains and distortions and high gains. Then you want to start worrying about modulation. You want to keep in mind that you're going to build from right to left. And the reason why, as far as I can figure out, is because generally guitar players are right-handed, because the instrument was designed that way originally. So pedal boards were designed from right to left, meaning your envelope filter, which usually you would adjust with your foot, is on the right side, not the left side, because if you're right-handed, generally it's easier to use that right foot to control an envelope filter than it is to use your left foot to control one. So pedals are designed kind of backwards logic, where you wire them from right to left instead of things left to right like we read. Anyway, moving forward, that's the way you want to lay out your pedals, from right to left. You want envelope filters or light drives going into higher gains. Then you'll add your modulation. And same kind of thing, it's going to go right to left. Now, these can be swapped around a bit. They're all timed effects. Some people like delays after their reverbs. Some people, essentially reverb is delay, just so you all know. Reverb is just delay. That's what it is. But anyway, some people like delay after reverb, some people like reverb after delay. I personally like it like this because I like to have the sound of chorus on my trails, but some people will even put chorus after delay so that their trails hit the chorus. I don't know, I feel like it's wrong generally, but again, there is really no wrong way, except you can't put drives after all of this. So a basic setup would look something like this. You would have your guitar going into your drives, and then from your drives to your modulations, and then from your modulations into your clean amp. Now, I stress that it has to be a clean amp, and here's why. So like I mentioned in the beginning with the pedal setup, you don't want drives after your modulation. So this is what it would sound like going into a clean amp with some delay. There it is. Nice little trails, everything's clean. Now here's that same setup going into a high gain amp or a distorted amp. It's still the same signal path that you saw here, but it's now going into distortion, a high gain amp, something that has clipping in the front of the amp. So you might hear that and be like, well, it's kind of unique. It's kind of cool. I don't hate it. It won't sound good live with a drummer behind you and a bass player. You won't hear it. And if you get it up loud enough to hear it, it's just going to sound like absolute chaos. It does not work. It just doesn't work. But there is a solution, and this is the solution. On some boards, you can order a patch bay. So I have a Temple board, and on the side, it has a patch bay that I've wired however I want, because essentially all the patch bay is just places to plug 1/4 inches. So on the bottom side of my board, I can run all my pedals and run them into the patch bay, and on the other side I can put my connection to my guitar or connection to my amp. And so this is the way that I think is ideal for someone who wants to play with a high gain amp and still not have those crazy distorted delays. And the best part is I have a fix so that you're not stuck only using a high gain amp. I'll explain everything. So the way I have my board wired is I have run the input of the drive section, as seen here, into my first pedal, which is my wah. Then I have it going through all of my drives and then coming out to the output, seen here, of the drive section. Then I have an input for my modulation section, as seen here. I then run it through all my modulation and then through the output of the patch bay. Now, what I'm able to do with that is this. So what I have going on here, and I know it might look a little confusing, is I have my guitar put into the input, the very first plug on my board. Then it comes out of my drives and into the front of my amp. Then on the back of my amp, I use the effects out to go into the input of my modulations. It goes through my modulation, and then it comes out the output and back into the input of the back of the amp. So essentially, I'm keeping my clean modulation into a clean part of the amp that only hits the power tubes after the drive tubes. There's two sets of tubes in the amp: drive tubes, power tubes. Power tubes power the amp, drive tubes drive the front of the amp. It's just all it is. Small little guys, drive tubes, generally. Big, fat, long ones, power tubes. Cool? Power tubes, drive tubes. Power tubes, drive tubes. And so here's what it sounds like going into the back of the amp with modulation and the front of the amp with drives. And the cool thing is, so all the delays now are clean. They have the sound of the gain in them, but they're not causing the gain to modulate, which just doesn't sound good. This sounds clean, precise, and I can do stuff like I could still send drives into it. So I could send a high gain into the high gain, and it's gonna be loud, right? But sustain for days. So it's a lot of fun, and you can have fun with it, but you should always put those drives first. Here's some wah going into it. So that's that setup, and that's all fine and dandy, and you might say, oh no though, what happens if I'm at a gig and something goes wrong with my amp and the only other amp there is just a clean amp? But I know I still like the distortions on my pedals. How do I switch back and forth with this setup? It's impossible, right? How would you send your drives to your choruses if you don't have an effects loop on the amp? You might even say, I would never do that. I'd never be able to play with a clean amp again. Well, there's an easy fix. This guy right here. And this is how I do it. Let me take away this high gain thing. Now you've got a front of amp setup, and that's how you do it. Essentially, you have your guitar going into the input, and then you just use a little jumper to go from the output of the drive section to the input of the mod section. And then you're out the mod section straight to a clean amp. This is awesome because if that's the scenario, it takes a few seconds to switch it over and you're back to this. So that's it, folks. That is how to wire your board so that you can easily switch between high gain amps with effects loops and clean amps where you would just go into the front of the amp. It was a long one, but it was a fun one, and there's lots to talk about. If you have questions or if you have other ways that you like to do it, please comment down below. Let me know. If you haven't liked the video, please do that. It helps me a lot. And tell your friends, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. I'll see you tomorrow for Theory Thursday.